JP Morgan does. We move $10 trillion of money around the world every day. We bank some of these companies in 30 countries. We bank countries. We bank the World Bank, the IMF. We bank the United States government. You have to be big. You can't do those things and be small. I applaud this.
The banks usually have the biggest buildings in every city, and it really seems like they're running the show. But they're really just facilitators for other organizations and power players working behind the scenes. However, this does not mean that the banks do not have much more power than almost any public entity that exists outside of BIS and the central banks. Most people think the banks are just businesses that hold your money to keep it safe. But this could not be further from the truth. Banks are not humble intermediaries. They're private businesses that, through financial controls, have managed to put entire national governments at their feet, including here in the US. You see, these institutions have a ton of control in society that goes back hundreds of years in many cases. They haven't made their fortune from the fees they charge their customers, though. That's just extra cash they use for the investments and influence campaigns that bring in the big bucks. We're talking whoppers. In fact, most of the big banks have a deep history of corruption, and many of their fortunes can be traced directly back to war, slavery, cartels, market manipulation, and political interference. Their fingerprints are all over some of the biggest market crashes and atrocities of the past few hundred years. And that's actually their job, to be hands or the henchmen of the powers that shouldn't be. Remember, at the end of this series, I'm going to show you an alternative future. It's kind of the only one that works for me and my people, so you're probably going to want to jump on board. Choo choo, let's get it. I'm not a financial advisor. Welcome to the channel, I'm your host BitBoy, and today we're getting deep. If you want your political, financial, and historical IQs to increase, watch this entire video. All right, let's start tracing the routes of today's world-dominating banking system. Let's start with the Great Depression. Take a look at how the banks were at the forefront of the collapse and took most of the blame, allowing the true power players to avoid any accountability whatsoever. And I repeat, this is not on accident. This was planned from the beginning. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan banks are both now widely understood to have played a significant role bringing about the Great Depression in the 1930s. There were definitely other factors at play at the time, especially the actions of the Federal Reserve. But the Fed is deeply involved with all of these banks as well. The banks benefited from wild speculation on the market and were involved in market manipulation. Many of these banks were also giving out huge loans for customers to buy stocks on margin without any standards. Kind of like the crypto exchanges that were giving millions of dollars to Three Arrow Capital with no collateral so they could make degen trades. JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs were especially notorious for this, but the Federal Reserve looked the other way. In fact, JP Morgan was one of the key figures involved in the creation of the Federal Reserve, as described in G. Edward Griffin's famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Many analysts and historians now agree that the Federal Reserve's policies also played a major role in creating and prolonging the Great Depression. Meanwhile, the fortunes of everyone involved with these banks and the Federal Reserve exploded during this time, especially JP Morgan, the other fellers, and that other famous R family with both children. You know what I'm saying? The banks involved with the crash are still some of the most powerful banks in the world today, and they're still screwing us over. This type of activity has continued with Goldman Sachs up to this very day. In the early 2000s, Goldman Sachs was involved in helping the Greek government hide its debt levels through complex financial instruments and derivatives, which became a major factor in the European debt crisis. Then in 2008, the bank was heavily involved in the subprime mortgage crisis, creating and selling mortgage-backed securities while betting against them through credit default swaps. The bank faced multiple lawsuits and settlements of $5 billion for its role in the financial collapse, including the notorious Abacus deal. Bank of America was also heavily involved in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, and they, probably more than anyone, are responsible for the 10 cities that have begun to sprawl across the country. In the midst of this crisis, as people were losing their homes, Bank of America was getting in trouble for doing everything they could to kick more people out of their homes through shady foreclosure practices like robo-signing, where they're just churning out foreclosure notices without going through them individually. They had to pay an $8.5 billion settlement for these practices in 2011, and then in 2013, they had to pay another $13 billion for misleading investors about the quality of the mortgage-backed securities they sold. The government got that money, not the people who are now homeless because of this. Citibank was another financial institution that contributed to the crisis by selling toxic mortgage-backed securities. In 2014, it agreed to a $7 billion settlement with the U.S. government over these practices. If we look behind Citibank, we can find shareholders that go all the way back to the bankers that benefited from the Great Depression, including those other fellers I talked about earlier. Back then, Citibank was called Citibank of New York, and the headquarters is actually still there in New York City today. And guess what? The Rockefeller Center. In the US, during the peak of the foreclosure crisis, it was estimated that banks owned around 500,000 foreclosed properties. And that's only counting new foreclosures that happened during the crisis. Congress had the opportunity to prevent these foreclosures, but decided not to. That number of foreclosures, at around 500,000, is pretty close to the same number as the current homeless population of the country. I'm not saying that all of those people still wouldn't have been homeless if it wasn't for these banks, but it's a very interesting and telling statistic nonetheless. I saw some recent news about Citibank this week, actually. An official at the US State Department thanks Citibank for the role it's taking in rebuilding Ukraine. I thought this was a bit odd considering that Citibank was one of the last Western banks to pull out of Russia. But then I remembered that banks are famously known to fund both sides in many major wars throughout history. During the First World War, JP Morgan was accused of doing business with the Allied powers in Britain and France, while they were also doing business with their enemies in Germany. Then in the Second World War, the Union Banking Corporation, where George W. Bush's grandpa, Prescott Bush, was a director, was accused of maintaining business connections with Nazi Germany, despite being based in the US. UBC's assets were seized in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act. This has continued in the many wars that have sprung up around the world in the century since. These are just a few of the biggest or most recent cases where wealthy and influential people work through commercial banks, central banks, and government agencies to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else. In future videos, we're going to dig much deeper into the roles that governments, cartels, corporations, hedge funds, and other facilitators play in this web of corruption. You should also go back and check out the rest of this series I started about a month ago, where I focus on some of the other power players and organizations involved. These videos should be a good jump-off point to get your own research started, because this stuff goes even deeper than we can cover here on YouTube. If you want to dig deeper into my thoughts, simply join me on my Discord server, link down below. Starting this week, Discord is going to be my new home base for social media. So I got, be blessed. BitBoy out.